You're muted.
You're muted. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Sanctuary Online. Cheryl and I are calling in from Canada.
You're next to each other.
Yeah, we are coming across, unfortunately, to offer a eulogy to a very close friend. And yet it got us over across the border. So we're, you know, the show must go on, right? No matter where you are in the country. We've got a few friends out at sea tonight that can't be with us, but we've decided, with the many questions that you all have asked us, especially you, Dr. Aaron, yes, to extend our 3-part series, make it a 4-part series. But we had a little chat as a group, and so many of the questions in our Human Sexuality in the Bible series have been around homosexuality in the Bible. We thought, well, you know what? We still have the source for that arena as well with Ken. So what we're doing is one of our favorite quotes, me and Cheryl, of Ken's in CLM. Ken said, if the church could get human sexuality right, we wouldn't be talking about homosexuality. And because the church hasn't done a great job of getting human sexuality right, we thought we'd try that here at Sanctuary. And yet there are still so many questions. We have asked Ken to condense, Ken, like a 2-hour session into a gorgeous 45 minutes. So the way it's going to run, my friends, and I think all of you have been on with us before, is that Ken is going to go through the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, and share with us, and we'll take a quick break. And if you have any questions, once again, please place them all in the chat. And if they're about the Hebrew text, we will then kind of scrape those. Ken, if you pause right after that teaching component, see if there's any questions directly related to the Hebrew text. And then, especially because you just lifted this up for us tonight, Carol, how helpful this has been, we will push into the New Testament, and we will try and cover as much as we can. And at the end, we've got a special offer for you, a special prize of even more if you've enjoyed this. And then I'm going to be really quick here and offer my screen share. What we're doing is we're going to go with the part 3 tonight, and we are going to stay with our book club next week. But then the following week, we're excited to offer kind of the November sneak preview. Part 4, the concluding portion of this Human Sexuality in the Bible series, will be November 2nd. We have an amazing course called Giving Tuesday, where we help you try and make the most of your Giving Tuesday. So if you run a nonprofit, are on a board of a nonprofit, know anybody that runs a nonprofit, Kristen, you know, go ahead and have folks sign us up on November 9th, and we will try and help people really maximize what's happening in November. And then we are just incredibly blessed. If any of you have heard of the movie The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which is in theaters now, starring Jessica Chastain as Tammy Faye Baker, our good friend Steve Peters was really one of those pivotal points in Tammy Faye's life, and he's in that movie. He credits Ken for a good deal of who he is, why he is, and how he has been resilient through living with AIDS for as long as he has. And we will be able to interview Steve. We are so incredibly blessed to have this opportunity. And then we will finish November, go into December. Yay for all of us. I just wanted you to be able to understand we've done part 1, part 2, part 3. And we will do the book club next month. So if you haven't had a chance to yet, let's see, get this fabulous book, you have an entire week to read. So Kristen, 20 minutes a day, right? You can get her done, okay? Ken, I am going to stop talking and hand it back to you tonight. And so you can push through this and try and cover as much as you can. I know you've been busting yourself yesterday, today. So my friends, open your ears, open your hearts. Ken, they are all yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks everybody for being back. You know, very conservative religious people like to pretend that they take the Bible literally, and they like to say cute little things like God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. But the truth is that what we're going to talk about tonight, this whole issue of homosexuality in the Bible, is not a simple one, and it's not solved with little one-liners and things like that. It takes some time to understand this issue, and that's why we've devoted this whole session tonight to this, because so many of your questions revolved around this topic. And so what we're going to do tonight is just try to go from the top to the bottom of this subject, so it's all inclusive in one session here. I'd like to invite you to just, instead of trying to write down everything, I say maybe just kind of listen tonight. Remember that this is recorded, and I'm also going to give you, as Joe said, another resource online for you to go back to and be able to recover any of the details and things that you might have wanted to just refresh in your mind or share with somebody else. So here we go. Modern scholarship on this whole subject of homosexuality in the Bible really began in 1955 with the publication of this little book by Derek Sherwin Bailey entitled Homosexuality in the Western Christian Tradition. That book deals almost exclusively just with the story in the 19th chapter of Genesis about the destruction of the city of Sodom. And of course, that's where we want to begin as well. So Bailey in this book begins by saying that the first thing we have to do is understand and translate one Hebrew word. The word is yadha, and it translates to know, to know. Remember in this story, and let's just review it real quickly. In this story, two angelic beings who are disguised as male human beings come into the city of Sodom, and Lot is sitting inside the gate of Sodom, and he offers them the hospitality of his home for that night. But then, beginning with verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came out tonight? Bring them out so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please, only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow," meaning Lot, "came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Send them out that we may know them. What does that mean? The whole meaning of this story revolves around that. Bailey points out, first of all, that word, yadha, is used 943 times in the Old Testament, 933 times, all but 10 times. It means simply to get to know somebody, to become acquainted with somebody, to meet somebody for the first time. So Bailey says that in this story, we should begin by assuming that what these people wanted to know was, who are these people who are in that house with you? Send them out that we may become acquainted with them. And there is good reason to believe that, because the city of Sodom was one of several cities. They're called the cities on the plain. They're ancient cities, they're walled cities, they're heavily fortified, and they had a reputation for constantly being at war with each other. And so they were very suspicious of strangers, because any stranger who came into their city might be a spy from one of the other cities. If any of you grew up in really small towns, you might understand this. I remember when I was in the 5th grade, a family moved into our little town in southern Mississippi, and they had a son, a boy my age, who was going to come into the 5th grade. And I remember my parents sitting me down and saying, "Don't become friends with him until we find out what his daddy does, and until we find out what church they're going to belong to." So what these people were suspicious of, was anybody who came into their city that they did not already know. Now, Lot had a very special status in this town. Remember, it says, they said about Lot, this fellow came here as an alien. Because they were also suspicious of each other, people who were born and raised in any of these towns had a certain set of rights and privileges, but people who just moved into the town and lived there, like Lot did, had fewer privileges. There's one Hebrew word to describe those people. Those resident aliens, the Hebrew word is ger. Lot was a ger, and the ger had fewer privileges than the resident citizens of that town. And one of the privileges that a ger did not have was they couldn't bring a stranger into the town without first having their credentials checked. So Bailey concludes, first of all, that the meaning of this word in this context is send these people out so that we can get to know them and find out who they are. He says then that the real sin of Sodom was the failure of this town, everybody except Lot, to extend the ancient code of hospitality to these strangers. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. So if it seems reasonable that we're not dealing here with a mob of homosexuals, that every man to the last man of Sodom was not a homosexual, and if they were, why was Lot offering them his daughters to begin with? Then the question becomes, where does homosexuality enter into this picture? And this is very important. Homosexuality does not, but specific kinds of homosexual acts might. Kenneth Dover, in his book, Greek Homosexuality writes, quote, human societies at many times and in many regions have subjugated strangers, newcomers, and trespassers to homosexual anal violation as a way of reminding them of their subordinate status. Bishop John Spong writes, quote, a popular way to insult the stranger was to force him to take the female role in the sex act. Nothing was more insulting to a man in the ancient world than to be treated like a woman. So an alien who was to act out a woman's role in sexual activity would receive the ultimate power insult that the male citizens of the city could administer. So that makes it unquestionably clear that if to know does have a sexual meaning here, then it is rape. And we all know that rape is not sex. Rape is sexualized violence. So continuing with the idea that homosexuality is not what this story is all about, let's look at a very important principle of biblical interpretation that says simply, let the Bible interpret itself. In this case, let's ask, is there anywhere else in the Bible where it says why the city of Sodom was destroyed? And the answer is, well, yes, it happens to, as a matter of fact, in a number of places. The prophet Ezekiel in the 16th chapter says that the sin that caused Sodom to be destroyed was pride and not caring for the poor and the needy in their midst. The prophet Isaiah in the 3rd chapter says the sin that caused Sodom to be destroyed was a general lack of justice. The prophet Jeremiah in chapter 23 says that the sin of Sodom was heterosexual adultery. You know those books that come in between the Old Testament and the New Testament called the Deuterocanonical books that are in Catholic Bibles but are not always in Christian Bibles? The book of Ecclesiastes there in chapter 16 says that the sin that caused Sodom to be destroyed was pride. And the book of Wisdom in chapter 19 says that the sin of Sodom was in fact inhospitality. In the Gospels, did you know that Jesus tells us specifically why the city of Sodom was destroyed? In Matthew 10, 9 through 15, he says, but whenever, talking to his disciples, whenever you come to a town and they do not welcome you, go out into the open streets and say, the very dust of your town, which sticks to your feet, we wipe off in protest. But understand this, The dominion of God is at hand, and I tell you that on that day, Sodom will fare better than that town. Jesus said to his own disciples, if you encounter inhospitality, tell them that on the day of judgment, their town is going to fare worse than the inhospitality that caused the city of Sodom to be destroyed. So in addition to the Bible interpreting itself, we know that it was not until hundreds of years after Genesis was written that any kind of sexual implication was attached to the sin of Sodom. In fact, the first time we encounter any reference to a sexual clause is about 100 years before the Common Era in a document called the Palestinian Pseudepigrapha. And it says, yes, that Sodom was destroyed because of sexual sins, but it lists them and they are all specifically, clearly heterosexual. The first time any homosexual implication is attached to the sin of Sodom is about 200 years into the Common Era in a little book called the Book of Jubilees. Dr. John Boswell, in this book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, which, by the way, is if you're only going to buy one book, that's it. That's the one to buy. He points out further that the early Christian writers, almost all of whom wrote commentaries about this story in Genesis 19, all of them ignore any sexual implication to the sin of Sodom. For example, Origen, remember him? Origen was so sex negative, he was so ascetic, he's the one who castrated himself and then recommended that all Christian men castrate themselves so that they would be free of all of this nasty stuff having to do with sex. Origen wrote this about this story. He said, hear this, you who close your homes to guests. Hear this, you who shun the traveler as an enemy. Lot lived among the Sodomites. We do not read of any other good deeds of his. He escaped the flames. He escaped the fire on account of one thing only. He opened his home to guests. The angels entered the hospitable household, but the flames entered those homes closed to guests. So let's just pause for a minute and realize that the prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, all of whom list specific reasons why Sodom was destroyed, none of them mention homosexuality. And the early Christian writers, like Origen, were referring to exactly the same story and to exactly the same words that so many people today claim, well, this story is obviously a story that condemns homosexuals. Every serious student of the Bible knows that we take those earlier primary sources much more seriously because they were so much more intimately familiar with the language and with the culture and with the customs of the people who were actually involved in these stories. So let's begin to conclude our look at Genesis 19 with what Bailey says are the two real issues that we should be paying attention to in this story. He says the first real issue he calls the sacredness of the male guest in the ancient world. We would call that the importance of hospitality. Now, it's kind of difficult for us in our modern world to understand why that was so important to them. For example, in August of this year, Tom and Darcel and I got in a car here in Austin to drive for 4 days to visit family in upstate New York. It never occurred to us to wonder where we were going to sleep at night, or was there going to be food out there for all that time, and how were we going to get gas for the car? But those were in the ancient world. If you left the safety of your home for more than a day, you could literally die in that desert world if you could not depend upon the hospitality of others. Another reason it was so important to them was that obviously when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, they were not treated with hospitality. So when they came out of Egypt, God commanded them always to show hospitality to strangers. Exodus 22:21 says, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens once in the land of Egypt." And in Leviticus 19:34, "The alien who resides with you shall be as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself." Don't you wish that some people who hold certain feelings about immigration would read this? "You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." So it's actually easy for people today to miss the real sin of Sodom, because our society is obviously more preoccupied with sexual things than it is with issues around hospitality. But that wasn't true in the ancient world. If, for example, you go to the 6th chapter of Joshua, we read a story there that makes it clear that they thought inhospitality was a much more serious sin than a sexual infraction. In that story, another whole city is destroyed for lack of hospitality. The only person whose life is spared is a prostitute named Rahab. And Rahab's life was spared only because she was the only person who showed hospitality to the messengers that Joshua had sent into the town. And by the way, if you go to the 1st chapter of Matthew, you'll find out that that prostitute, Rahab, was the great, 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 great grandmother of Jesus. So Bailey says the first real issue is the sacredness of the male gender it was the sacredness of the guest in the ancient world. The second real issue, he says, is what he calls the sacredness of the male gender in the ancient world. Dr. George Edwards, in his book, has a term for this patriarchal influence that is a little less kind than the sacredness of the male gender. He calls it phallic aggression. And he writes this: "I would further argue that the eclipsing of phallic aggression, that is the sexual violence that did occur in the exegesis of Genesis 19, serves the subtle purpose of shifting the horrific guilt in these stories from the account of masculinity run amok to that of homosexuality." Thorkel Vanguard, in his book, Phallus, a Symbol and Its History in the Male World, writes this: "The aggressive element, devoid of any eroticism, is precisely what is operating in such scenes of collective violence as that described in the biblical story of Sodom." So both of these writers are saying, pretending that this story is about homosexuality is nothing more than a way of shifting the blame away from what it really is, which is just toxic masculinity, testosterone poisoning. So the point for us here is that there are things in this story, there are things happening in this story that are the exact opposite of the values that those of us who are people of faith hold sacred. But those things are not about homosexuality, and they're not about homosexuals.
Funzy.
For example, they are about the disvaluing of female children and sexual violence. Growing up, I heard a lot of preachers practically foaming at the mouth, trying to convince people that this story was all about condemning homosexuality. But we know, because of what we're doing now, that what they should have been talking about was that Lot was willing to sacrifice his own 2 daughters to this mob just to save the lives of these men who were total strangers to him. Or why don't they ever talk about the implications of that for the epidemic of child sexual abuse, which continues in this country and around the world. And we know who statistically is doing it. For example, Pediatrics Magazine, which is the professional journal of the pediatric medical profession, did a longitudinal study of child sexual abuse. And they reported that children are more than 100 times more likely to be sexually abused by heterosexual men than by homosexual men. I believe that Bailey's first argument is where we do start, that these men wanted the strangers to come out so that they could become acquainted with them. But I don't think we can ignore the possibility that part of the inhospitable treatment that they might have received would have been sexualized violence. Now, to conclude this part on Genesis, this is a book by Father John McNeil entitled The Church and the Homosexual. And in this book, he writes these words: if this interpretation of the sin of Sodom is correct, then we are dealing here with one of the supremely ironic paradoxes of history. For thousands of years in the Christian West, homosexuals have been victims of inhospitable treatment. Condemned by the church, they have been victims of persecution, torture, and death in the name of a mistaken understanding of the crime of Sodom. The true crime of Sodom continues to be repeated every day. Now, the only place in Hebrew scripture where homosexual acts are specifically mentioned are in the book of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. They're brief. Let's just read them real quickly. In 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And then in 20:13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, there are a couple of very important things for us to understand, to really understand what these verses are about. And the first one is this, that chapters 17 through 26 of the book of Leviticus, I think last week I said 16 through 27, but it's, 20 through 26, it's chapters 17 through 26 of the book of Leviticus are a separate document. It was written before the book of Leviticus was written, and then it was inserted into the book when the book was written. The purpose of this document is spelled out very clearly in the document itself. In chapter 18, it says, "You are not to do as they do in the land of Egypt where you dwelt, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes." In other words, God is saying to the Hebrew people, I don't want you to be like those people in Egypt where you came from. Neither do I want you to be like the people in Canaan where you are going. Instead, the purpose of this document, which is called the Holiness Code, the purpose of this document stated very clearly is to begin to form a loosely knit group of nomadic tribes into a nation, into a unique nation. For what, and that's what they were. They were just desert tribes. Remember, when they came out of slavery in Egypt, it wasn't like the movie, The 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston didn't stand up there and part the water, and they didn't all walk through singing, at the same time. We know now that what we call the Exodus actually took place over a number of years. The Hebrew people streamed out of Egypt and into the desert for that 40-year experience there. And it actually took quite a bit of time for that to happen. The Hebrew word for holy literally means separate. And so what God is saying to them is do these things, don't do these things, so that you will be a separate and unique people. The Holiness Code served the purpose of fencing out the non-Hebrew world so that the people of Yahweh could become their own, have their own unique identity. And they did that by establishing a ritual and ceremonial code saying, do these things, don't do these things, and that's how you will form yourselves into a nation with its own unique identity. So then, regardless of whether your transgression was a violation of one of the many sexual prohibitions that are in the Holiness Code, or any of the other many different things that are listed there, if you broke one of those laws, it meant that you were breaking this ritual ceremonial code that made you different from these other people. And that was called an abomination. When I was a child, that word scared me to death because preachers were always preaching about abominations, and I just lived in terror that I might be one. And then, a little bit later in my life realized, well, shoot, I am, one. But the Hebrew word for abomination is the word tovah. And the word means a difference or a contrast. Remember when we were talking about the difference between Lot as a ger and as a resident alien and the citizens in the city? In that story in Genesis, we find the word tovah used to describe the difference between a ger and a resident alien and a citizen of a town. In Genesis 46, we find that exact same word describing the difference between people who live in towns and people who live on oases out in the desert. We also find it in the Old Testament to describe the difference between people who are merchants and live in town and people who are shepherds and wander around with sheep in the wilderness. Later in the prophets use this word abomination, tovah, to describe the difference between the Israelites, the Hebrew people, and all of the other nations. But in the Holiness Code, if you committed an abomination, it meant you broke that ritual purity, which violated that code of separateness that made you unique from all other people. Dr. James Nelson, and as I read these next two quotes, do you remember our conversation about morals and ethics? Dr. James Nelson, in his book Embodiment, says, these acts were not condemned because they were intrinsically evil, but because they were associated with idolatrous acts which violated cultic purity. And Dr. Peter Gomes in the Good Book writes, the word we translate as abomination does not mean there is divine retribution for doing this in the same way that you are forbidden to do certain things in the commandments. This is very different. The rules in Leviticus are rules for preserving cultural identity, to define one tribe as over against another tribe, the Israelites over against the Canaanites. These are not ethics, but rules for tribal survival in an ancient society. And actually, that just makes common sense, because when you read these lists of things in the Holiness Code that are abominations, it's clear to any reasonable person that saying you can't sacrifice your child by throwing it into a fire and burning it up can't possibly be carrying the same kind of ethical weight as a prohibition that says you can't eat fruit off of a tree that's younger than 5 years old. And the Jewish rabbis themselves realized this. About 300 years before the Common Era, they translated their own Hebrew scriptures, these scriptures, they translated them from Hebrew into Greek for the first time. And Dr. Boswell, in his book, points out that when they came to the Holiness Code, these are Jewish rabbis translating their own Hebrew scriptures into Greek. When they came to Holiness Code and they saw all of these lists of things, they realized you can't just put all of these things together like this. And so they chose 2 Greek words and they made lists. They put lists of these things under each of those words. The first Greek word they chose was betalugma. And under that word, they listed all of the things that they felt were prescriptions that the Hebrews were told not to do just at that specific point in history and for a specific reason at that time. Very much like the definition we have of morals, what any group of people decides to enforce for itself at any given time. And they put things under there like don't eat fruit from a tree that's younger than 5 years old. Then the other word they used in Greek was anomia. And under anomia, they listed all of those things which they felt like were eternally, intrinsically, ethically important for all people at all times, not just situationally, but at all times. Do you have to guess which one of those columns they put the two verses we're talking about under? They put those two verses under betalugma. They put these two verses under the column of things that were spoken only relevant at a specific time in history and for specific reasons. Now, there's another very important consideration in understanding these verses and the Holiness Code, and it's another principle of biblical interpretation. Remember the principle of letting the Bible interpret itself over there in Genesis? Well, this is called the principle of consistency, and applied to the Holiness Code, what it means is that it is a clear misuse of Scripture to impose upon other people only parts of the Holiness Code that reinforce your personal prejudices. Anyone who insists on pulling these two verses out and claiming that they are God's eternal law have to be consistent in obeying all the verses that come before them and all the verses that come after them, which include, but are not limited to, it is an abomination to grow two different kinds of plants in the same garden. It is an abomination to eat fruit from a tree less than 5 years old. It is an abomination to crossbreed cattle. It is an abomination to wear clothes made out of more than one fabric at the same time. It's an abomination for women to wear red dresses. It's an abomination for men to shave their beards. It's an abomination to have your fortune told. It's an abomination to read a horoscope. It's an abomination to get a tattoo. It's an abomination to eat a steak rare. It's an abomination to eat shrimp or lobster or oysters anytime. And as I mentioned last week, it's an abomination to touch the skin of a dead pig, which means football is an abomination. And of course, the Holiness Code required the death penalty for all adulterers. Now, there are many prohibitions in the Holiness Code which have been abandoned simply because information that we have now that they didn't have then has made them obsolete to us. For example, the Holiness Code has a very deep suspicion and fear of menstruation. When a woman was menstruating, she was considered to be unclean, and she was also considered to be a threat to male virility. So when a woman was menstruating, she was banished from the community, and the only way she could get back in was to go through a bunch of ritual cleansing, a bunch of ablutions, baths, special kinds of baths. Now, if a man and a woman had sex while the woman was menstruating, they were both cut off from their people forever. Now, since it's clear that we no longer believe those same things, and since it's clear that we no longer feel like we're obligated to obey the Bible's teachings about menstruation, why should we be bound to other injunctions that are just as irrelevant in our lives and in our experience today? Ignorance, regardless of how desperately people try to prop it up by quoting the Bible, is still ignorance. And remember, When ignorance grows up, it's called bigotry, and bigotry kills people. Personally, I hope that nobody who knows the God of Jesus Christ would ever insist that all of these laws are still in effect, that they're still relevant in our lives, and we're still obligated to obey them. Because if they do, then they will have to accept these words attributed to God in Leviticus 26:21, where it says, if you break any of these laws, God will send wild beasts out of the forest to eat your children. So let's conclude this section by saying that for all of us, let's conclude by saying that for all those people who just arbitrarily select these two verses and insist that they can use them against us, but ignore everything that comes before and ignore everything that comes after, it is not their love and respect for the Bible that causes their hostility toward homosexuality. It's their hostility toward homosexuality that allows them to abuse the Bible in this way. Okay, we are done with the Old Testament. Joby, can I answer a couple of questions or can we move on?
Man, I've got some good questions in here, Ken, but you've got to say that last line again. That's worth capturing. Can you offer that last line again?
Yes. People who insist on enforcing just these two verses and use them against us, ignoring everything that comes before and everything comes after, it is obvious that it is not their love or respect for the Bible that causes their hostility toward homosexuality. It's their hostility toward homosexuality that allows them to abuse the Bible in this way.
That is gold, Ken. Man, goodness, thank you. Yeah, there's 4 good questions in here, Ken. I know you want to keep on pressing, but I think they're worth maybe at least a quick answer. I'm gonna lift up each one. One question way back is to why are the words sodomite and sodomy so similar?
Because they both come from the name of the town Sodom. Sodomite is a very incorrect translation of some words we're going to talk about in a minute in the New Testament, which we don't use it anymore, but it was used in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries to describe homosexuals. We'll call sodomites,
Right.
which came from misunderstanding that story was all about homosexuality. And sodomy is a word that is used in civil law to describe any number of things. As we said on the first night, sodomy in most states now is described as oral sex. It was originally a reference to anal sex, whether heterosexual or homosexual. And now in civil law, it has passed usage into oral sex.
Thank you, Ken. Had a feeling you'd know that. Nailed it. Kristen, make sure I get this one right. How can any study of the Bible overlook the seemingly clear meaning restated so many times that the sin of Sodom was inhospitality? How can they miss that by such a mark and stay missed,
Yeah, it takes real concentration. You really have to work. You really have to work at ignoring these things. You really have to have a point of view that you are just going to reinforce, no matter what happens. I always say that to beat somebody over the head with the Bible, you have to keep the Bible closed. And that's basically what these people do. They keep the Bible closed, in order to beat us over the head with it.
Lordy. And then Kristen again, and then I know this is hard to go back and forth, was the story, and I'm sure this is the story of Sodom, right, Kristen? Was it misinterpreted accidentally, or was it used by the new church to shape a behavior already part of the culture? Does that make sense to you, Ken?
This might even start to get into your, yeah.
Go ahead, Kristen.
I was gonna say that might be more for the New Testament part, as the, was it accidentally misinterpreted before Christianity or I don't know, maybe
No,
you started
actually,
this after I typed.
actually, as we mentioned, there was not a single homosexual implication attached to the sin of Sodom until 200 years into the Christian or the
Okay.
common
Yeah, I think
era.
you said that
And
after I
so,
typed the question already, so it
Yeah.
only came
Yeah.
about later.
right, much later.
And then Gary's agreeing with you. You and Clinton Crenshaw are on the same path. And then from Dr. Aaron, who started using this against homosexuals? Was it the patriarchy? You know, why? Was there money involved to target like who got pissed at homosexuals? Like where'd that come from?
Yeah. Well, yes, you're right with the very first one. Homophobia. Well, let's start with patriarchy. The main function of patriarchy, the way patriarchy substantiates itself and justifies itself, is through misogyny.
Yep.
And by the way, misogyny is not just a hatred of women, it is the hatred and fear of anything feminine. So the primary child of patriarchy is misogyny. And the primary child of misogyny is homophobia.
Yes.
98% of all violence against homosexual people is against the gay men. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen against lesbians, because it certainly does. But 98% happens against the gay men. Why? Because patriarchy perceives a gay man as a man who they would say, how dare you give up the privilege God gave you of being male, which makes you better, and instead subjugate yourself by acting like a woman.
Yes.
So yes, patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia.
Yes. Oh, classic, Ken. Thank you. Yes. All right. I think that is it.
Okay.
Kristen's nailing it one more time, besides football being an abomination and Kristen's cute leather jacket. Is there any mention at all, especially in the Hebrew text, of women with women, or like Kristen's question, were women just not important enough to mention?
Yeah, for the most part in patriarchy, women were not important enough to mention. There's only one reference to women with women, and that's in the New Testament. We'll talk about it in just a few minutes. But there is a story in the Old Testament that we're going to talk about next week when we talk about marriage and family. And so there is one story in the Old Testament that's really, really interesting that we'll cover next week.
All right, Ken, we have 7 minutes and I'm sure you can do it.
I don't think so, but here we go. Okay, when we come to the New Testament, the whole issue again is translation of two words, two Greek words, the word malakos and the word arsenokoitai. The word malakos is a very common Greek word. It's found 14 times in the Bible and all over the place in literature outside the Bible. It has a very clear meaning. It means something that is soft or pliable. It is often used to describe fabric that is moved around in the wind. That's what that word means, something that's soft and pliable. The word arsenokoitai is a totally different story. This is the only time the word is ever found anywhere inside the Bible or outside the Bible. And so everybody agrees that Paul made up this word. It is a compound Greek word. The first syllable of the word arseno is a male prefix in Greek. It means men. So the first half of the word means men. The second word, koitai, is a very, very crude, rough Greek word, which literally means a lot of sex, an excessive amount of sex. And so the word arsenokoitai literally means men having a lot of sex. And so we find both words in 1 Corinthians 6:9, and then we find just the word malakos in 1 Timothy 1:10. So let me read those real quickly. 1 Timothy 6:9. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. So both words, malakos and arsenokoitai, are in that list. In 1 Timothy 1:10, we read, This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother, for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which has been given to me. Now, the truth is that everybody who knows anything about Greek will tell you honestly that in these contexts, these words are just very difficult to understand and interpret as to what they really mean. That's clearly reflected, even if it's not always acknowledged, in the different ways in which these words are translated. For example, the word arsenokoitai, which literally means men having a lot of sex, in the very homophobic English-speaking Western world, the 9 best translations of the New Testament all give that word some kind of homosexual meaning, while in the rest of the world, in every other language, none of them do that. For example, in the Jerusalem Bible, in the German translation, translates the word to mean child molesters. The Italian translation of that Bible translates it as perverts without any homosexual connotation whatsoever. The French translation of the Jerusalem Bible translates the word arsenokoitai as people who have infamous habits. Trust the French to at least be honest enough to say, we have no idea, what this word means. It must mean people who are doing something that may not, be especially good. By contrast, that same Bible, the Jerusalem Bible in English, as well as the King James, the Revised Standard Version, the New English Bible, New International Version, all of them tend to give some kind of homosexual meaning to those words. Although, at least to the credit of the translators who wrote the NRSV, by the way, if you want to buy a Bible, be sure you buy this one, the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. It is the best translation that has ever been created of the Bible. And be sure you get the Oxford Annotated Edition, because at the bottom of each page, there are lots of notes and comments about what you find on that page. So on this page in 1 Corinthians 6:9, where we read about sodomites and male prostitutes and all of that, look at the note, look at what the Greek scholars who interpreted this put in the note at the bottom of the page. They wrote, the Greek terms translated male prostitutes and sodomites do not refer to homosexuals as in inappropriate older translations. Show that to your mama or whoever it is that keeps bothering you about this, because there it is right there in the Bible. By the way, read the footnotes of Genesis. They say the same thing. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So let's try to conclude this by saying that there is no reason ever for Holocaust to have any kind of homosexual meaning attached to it whatsoever. When the word is found outside of the Bible in patristic Greek, it always refers to somebody who lacks self-control. And Dr. Boswell points out that the few times when there's a sexual meaning to it, it is always masturbation. And if arsenokoitai has anything to do with homosexuality, it is a peripheral reference to temple prostitutes. For example, Paul was writing to the people in Corinth, and we know from literature outside the Bible that in the city of Corinth, there were more than 1,000 male and female temple prostitutes in the temple of Diana alone. So if Paul was writing to those people and he made up a word that means men having a lot of sex, it's pretty clear to me he was probably talking about those temple prostitutes. And if that is the case, then it is no condemnation of homosexual people or of homosexuality. Dr. Boswell concludes about arsenokoitai by writing this: perhaps the most extreme evidence that arsenokoitai did not mean homosexual in the time of Paul is offered by the vast amount of writing extant on the subject of homoerotic sexuality in Greek, in which the word does not appear. It is extremely difficult to believe in Greek it is extremely difficult to believe that if the word actually meant homosexual, no previous or contemporary author would have used it in a way which clearly indicated this connection. There is no reason to believe that Holocaust or arsenokoitai connoted homosexuality in the time of Paul or for centuries thereafter. Okay, I'm going to skip down a couple of things here. So when we look at the translation of those two words and those two verses, there's one thing we can say pretty clearly, which is that anybody who wants to insist that those two words are about homosexuals or about homosexuality never bothered to look beyond a bad English translation. So the last verse that we come to is the verse in Romans, which a lot of people think is the most damning one in the Bible. Actually, it's by far the easiest one to explain. This is in the first chapter of Romans, verses 26 and 27. For that reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women, and here's the one reference in the New Testament to women, their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with the women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Now, let me catch up with myself real quickly here. Okay, once again, the issue for us here is going to be an issue of translation. First of all, we have to translate these two Greek words, paraphusin, which means against nature. And again, we're going to start off by using that principle of biblical interpretation that says, let the Bible interpret itself. Do we find that anywhere else? Yes, actually, Paul uses that exact same phrase, paraphusin, against nature, 7 other times in the Bible. People love to use that phrase to say that homosexuality is unnatural or that it is against nature. For example, Warren Chisholm, who is a former Republican member of the House of Representatives here in Texas, wrote an article in Vanity Fair magazine in which he said, quote, homosexuality is demeaning to man. I mean, animals don't do it, close quote. Our old friend Jerry Falwell on KCRA radio in Sacramento, California said, quote, God teaches that homosexual lifestyle is a perverted lifestyle. There's no question about it. When one practices that lifestyle, which only humans do, animals don't, God cannot condone that, close quote. Now, what both of them are doing is assuming that what Paul meant by nature is what by natural is what happens in nature. They're wrong about that, but even then, their statements are patently ridiculous to anybody who ever lived on a farm, and they are ridiculous. They certainly have been to sex researchers. The Kinsey researchers wrote this, quote, we found homosexual activity as common among animals as among humans, close quote. And since then, numerous examples have been cited, about many different species of animal and birds where there are same-sex lifelong couplings among 2 animals or 2 birds of the same gender. To understand what Paul meant by the word phusis in this context, nature, we let the Bible interpret itself, and we find that with only one exception, every time Paul uses this word, what he means is cultural and religious heritage. He means what's traditional. He means what's expected, very close to what our definition of morals is. In other words, what is culturally expected and not necessarily what God commands. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11:14, Paul says, long hair is paraphusin and a shame to men. Now, Paul wrote that in the Hellenistic Greek world, where long hair was a shame and men all cut their hair short. But he would never say that standing next to Jesus, who was a 1st century Jewish man who didn't cut his hair. Also in Romans 11:24 describes how God chose to let the Gentiles join into that original covenant that was made only for the Hebrews. And so in that verse, Paul says God acted parophusin. God acted against nature. So clearly, if God acts against nature, acts of nature can't be against God. So for Paul, if a thing is against nature, it is unexpected, it is unusual, because it violates social expectation and tradition. What people like Falwell and Chisholm were trying to do was read back into Paul the philosophy of natural law that actually wasn't even developed until 1,000 years after Paul died. For Paul, nature was not universal law. It described the character of people, a person or people. It was often quite ethnic, but it was always of human origin. Now, the other word that we have to understand in Greek here is the word aphantes. And this one gets a little bit more, a little weirder for us, because the Greek language has a verb tense that we don't have in English. The tense is called the aorist tense. And the aorist tense in Greek describes something that began at some point in the past, that continues at least up to the present, and continues out of personal choice. It is being done out of personal choice. One thing that most biblical scholars will agree on is that this word cannot apply to people who are naturally homosexually oriented. It can only apply to people who were naturally heterosexually oriented, but who were engaging in homosexual acts. Dr. Walter Wink, who's professor of biblical theology at Auburn Theological Seminary in New York, put it this way. He said, Paul assumed that the people he was condemning in Romans were heterosexuals, giving up their regular sexual orientation for something that was foreign to them. In other words, Paul really believed that those whose behavior he condemned were heterosexual and that they were behaving in ways that were unnatural to them. Paul believed that everyone was heterosexual. He had no concept of heterosexual orientation, close quote. Now, here's something I hope you'll do later. Go back and read the whole first chapter of Romans. Remember, we're pulling 2 verses out like this. We're just pulling 2 verses out. But go back and read that whole chapter, and you will find that the context of the whole first chapter of Romans is that things are being consciously turned around. He starts off by saying, you know there's only one God, so why are you pretending that there's more than one? The whole context of the chapter is that people are turning things around. The whole point of Romans 1 is that it is a sin to reject your calling. It is a sin to go off of the path that is given to you. Remember how we defined, the New Testament defined sin last week? Hamartia, you missed the mark. You are less than what God created you to be. That is exactly what the whole chapter, first chapter of Romans is about. Paul would literally be undermining his own argument for the whole first chapter of Romans if those people in question were not naturally inclined to the opposite sex in the same way that they were naturally inclined to monotheism. That's the point that he is making. He's saying, you believe in one God, why are you worshiping a bunch of gods? You know you're heterosexual, why are you acting differently? The whole point was that these people did not lack a heterosexual orientation. Paul's point here was these people specifically had a heterosexual orientation. This was clearly stated by St. John Chrysostom, who was the bishop of Constantinople in the 4th century, writing about these 2 verses. He said, it would be impossible for a man to abandon a natural sexual attraction for women unless he first had a natural sexual attraction for women. A man cannot abandon a sexual attraction he does not have. So Romans 1 makes it very clear that Paul and other first century writers didn't know about people like many of us. They just didn't know about people who were homosexually oriented, and they certainly had no experience with same-sex, loving, committed relationships. For Paul, all people were heterosexual. So homosexual acts are 3 things to Paul. First of all, they are deliberate choices to act contrary to your real identity. Second, they result in a conscious rebellion against God. And third, they always involve the exploitation of another person. So he may as well be writing about aliens from outer space, because none of that has anything to do with us today. Finally, discussing his book, Living Faith, in the San Francisco Chronicle, President Jimmy Carter said this: Jesus preached and talked about a whole gamut of sins, but he never mentioned homosexuality at all. So we should just not leave Christian scripture without making that point. If this were as important as so many people would have us believe it is, we can sure be assured that Jesus would have said something about it. So I want to close. In my book, I write about the 7 conclusions that I have reached after all of this. So the best biblical scholarship in the world now agrees there is no condemnation in the Bible of homosexuality as an orientation or of homosexual persons. After studying these few verses we often refer to as the clobber passages for many years, including taking 5 years of Koine Greek so I could interpret the New Testament text in the original language, and consulting with many Hebrew scholars, I have reached the following 7 conclusions. 1, there is no indication that biblical writers knew anything about persons who are homosexually oriented, who are sexually and affectionally oriented to their same gender. 2, the Bible never mentions homosexuality. There is not one word in either the Greek or Hebrew text which can or should be translated homosexual or homosexuality. The Bible does refer to specific same-sex acts in specific situations. 3, each of these situations is either ethically unacceptable, whether same-sex or opposite sex, like rape, or it is culturally and historically irrelevant to us, whether same-sex or opposite sex, like temple prostitution. 4, even these specific acts are not a primary concern to the biblical writers. At best, only 3 or 4 of more than 30 writers even mention them. 5, not one of these sets out to write about them. The references are always peripheral to some other subject. 6, if this subject were as important as so many would have us believe, Jesus would have said something about it. And 7, the Bible just does not provide answers to the questions that the church or society are asking. It is a mistake to use scripture to support any specific position. And then I want to read you just a really short little story here. True story. In 1976, I was invited to speak at a large United Methodist church in the western suburbs of Chicago. A group of about 200 gathered in the sanctuary on a Sunday evening. As I had been invited to do, I made a presentation about MCC and the uniqueness of our ministry. After a few questions and answers, everyone was invited to move to the social hall for refreshments and to continue the conversation. I was seated at a table covered with brochures that I had brought. The first person to approach me was an elderly woman who smiled and said, "You seem like such a nice young man. How can you be part of this when Jesus condemned it?" I said, "Actually, Jesus didn't say anything about it." She looked surprised and asked, "He didn't?" I said, "No, ma'am, he didn't." She leaned toward me and whispered sincerely, "You know, I have always suspected he was a little liberal."
Oh, Ken, dear God, I mean, before questions, just unmute and applaud, please, people. I mean,
Go tell that to your mama.
Yeah,
Go tell that to your
Yeah.
mama.
yeah, go
Oh
tell
my
that to your
gosh,
mama.
Ken.
That's like seminary in a box, people. You got 45 minutes of, you all here, you all have a new degree.
I love you took 5. I suffered through 1 year of Greek and I thought I was gonna have a nervous breakdown, but you make it come alive.
Wow.
Barely memorized the alphabet when I was in a sorority. The heck with
Yeah,
that.
Ken, you are such a gift to us. I want to say you're such a gift, and I feel foolish that I get upset when you probably have been upset about this your whole life. I mean, I don't know, but my goodness. I mean, I just, the tenacity with which you've had to probably keep teaching the masses the truth is really respected on my end. So thank you for being a truth teller.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, Joe and I had a conversation about, the last thing we want to talk about is homosexuality in the Bible, but
well, thanks for letting the
But
white girl
so-
ask the questions.
so-
The little white straight girl asked the questions.
yeah, the white straight girl did this to us. But the point is that people are still suffering and dying
yes.
because of this ignorance. We say things have gotten better and things have gotten better, but things are nowhere near perfect. Our young GLBTQ people would not still be killing themselves at the rates that there are. So it is important to be informed about these things. It is important to share this information with people who have open minds and really want to know. But remember this, you cannot reason a person out of a position they did not reason themselves into. So don't waste your time with people who are not going to do anything, but
Amen.
continue staying in their place of ignorance.
Absolutely.
Amen to that.
And also your questions, all of you prove that this is still something to go over. I mean, reaching the level of knowledge that you have, Ken, is something that most of us wouldn't even aspire to, but we still have to explain to our,
That's right.
well-intentioned but ignorant friends or family members, what about Sodom? Well, now, Kristen, you can say it's about inhospitality.
I wait till someone's inhospitable to me and I call them a sodomite. I'm just gonna.
That's a true
Oh my
sodomite.
God.
I can't
That's
spend the
a true
night.
sodomite.
Why are you such a sodomite?
That's a true sodomite. Yeah.
That'll open it. That'll open
You
a little
didn't
conversation.
RSVP to my party. You're such a sodomite. Why isn't anyone RSVPing anymore? Sodomites.
Sodomites. Hashtag sodomites.
Abominable sodomites.
Good.
That's a new
Before we,
hashtag. Yeah, you're right.
I don't know if we want to try to do any questions because we're 15 minutes over, but I did want, I promised you at the first, another resource.
Yes.
The presentation that I just made to you is an abbreviated one. I have a lecture on YouTube, which includes everything I just said to you, but it goes deeper into a lot of these things. And we have a PowerPoint that goes along with that presentation. And if you would like to have that PowerPoint, you can reach us at talktous@sanctuaryinthewoods.com, and we'll send you the PowerPoint, and then you can go on to YouTube and use the PowerPoint and follow through the longer lecture presentation that is on YouTube. By the way, I didn't even know this was on YouTube until this is a lecture that I did a number of years ago. As soon as you see it, you'll recognize it. My beard wasn't even gray yet. But I didn't even know it was on there until my son told me that he had seen it and watched it. Someone else put it up there, and they put it up. There are 4 different things. One is the full lecture all the way through, which I think is about an hour and a half. And then it's broken up into 3 sections. So you can watch either the 3 sections one at a time, or you can watch the full lecture all the way through. And this is what you have to do to get it. The person who put it up, I don't even recognize the name, but this is the way they titled it. You'd never find it. Go put into the search box on YouTube, "Same-Sex Christians Rejoice." Same-sex Christians rejoice, and that will give you all 4 of those options on YouTube.
Wow, thank you.
And
Thank
what
you,
we'll
thank you,
try
thank
and
you.
do is we'll try and pull those over to the Sanctuary channel, to the Sanctuary Online channel. Barb,
Okay,
maybe you
good,
and I
yeah.
can do some homework this week And then also in the email, now folks, if we don't have your email yet and you're not on our mailing list, tonight might be a good night to just jump on it and go ahead and throw your email address in the chat. Barb will grab that. And every week we tend to send one email. We don't spam you, but it has what happened last week, what's happening in the future, and in the coming weeks. And links like this, we can put on that email, and we can also attach the PowerPoint Ken was sharing about on that email. Okay, so if you're not sure we have it, go ahead and put your email address in the chat. And then Barb, can I get a head nod from you? You and I will go ahead and make sure we attach the PowerPoint to the email this week. And we will try and get a better link, Ken, to those lectures and maybe bring them over to Sanctuary Online. Okay.
So what I was thinking was for the folks who have attended one of these first three, any one of them, one or all, sending out a specific additional email that's got this link and the PowerPoint to it, rather than attaching it to the whole email
General
list blast.
email.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably smarter.
So you'll all get 2 this week.
It's not spamming you.
That's
It's,
okay.
you could get a Tesla or the second email. Who wants the second email? Okay. Sounds good. Aaron, do you have a question, my friend?
Yes, would it be safe to say that Martha Stewart is the most godly woman of us all then?
Yes, her hospitality is just immeasurable. It is limitless.
You're catching on there, Dr. Aaron.
But
Absolutely.
it is a gift. It is a
You're
spiritual
offering
gift.
some
It's a
some
spiritual
humor.
gift of
Yes,
hers.
yes,
No, but
it is a
It
spiritual
is,
gift.
period.
I love the way people like to hang on to their stereotypes, though. I was with my family last week, my sister, it's a long story, but several of them, and Steve Peters happened to, the woman came on who's playing in that role with Tammy Faye, and
Mhm.
she spoke of Steve Peters, and she constantly referred to him as a gay pastor. And I put on Steve's Facebook that I said to my family, oh, I know him, and he's much more than that. And
Yeah.
Steve thanked me, but what was so interesting to me is here I am an MCCer of 48 years, and my family tittered to each other and said, well, of course she would know him. She's gay and he's gay. Like we all know each other.
Right.
Makes for a
All
great
gay people
potluck,
know each
Cynthia.
We all know each other, of course.
Yeah, it makes for a great
It's
potluck.
not in the biblical sense.
Well, my friends, we are past the a little past the hour. Ken, thank you so much. I know what it's taken for you to just study the heck out of this and refresh, so you can cruise through it at fire. What's that called?
Record pace. Yeah.
Lightning
record
speed.
fire hose. And thanks to y'all for just opening up and listening and catching what you could catch. And Kristen, yes, I tried to spell the words right in the chat when I got there. But if you would like more, please just let us know and we'll make sure we get that out to you. And next week is book conversation. And now November 2nd is the closing, possibly, to this
Let me
amazing
just say,
series.
Joe, for those of you who ask questions that we have not yet answered, we are going to answer those on the 2nd and then close this series out.
We promise. Good night, y'all. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah,
Love
thank you
y'all.
very much.
Everybody.
Thank you.